Well, well. Look who wandered in after dark. You ever notice how every field has one of those things standing out there? Silent. Still. Always watching. People say they're made to frighten the crows, but I've always thought they were meant to frighten us. A scarecrow is a warning, a polite little reminder that the harvest remembers who fed it and who didn't. And tonight, my dark hearts, I have 5 of their stories to share with you. 5 tales of soil and sin, each one progressively darker and more horrifying. So gather close and keep your eyes on the field, because out there in the dark, something's always watching, waiting for you to forget the old rules. So gather close, my dark hearts, and listen carefully. Have you ever wondered what secrets lie buried in the soil, waiting for a single mistake to claw their way into the light? Some traditions are born from fear, and some fears are best left undisturbed. Good evening, my dark hearts. Settle in, and let me tell you a story from a place tucked away in the folds of forgotten maps. A small farming town called Hollow's Edge. Here, the harvest is governed by a rule as old as the dirt itself. A pact whispered from one generation to the next. Every autumn, when the moon hangs low and bleeds crimson onto the fields, the scarecrow must be raised at dusk to guard the crops. But it must, without fail, be taken down before the first hint of dawn. Should it remain to greet the sun, the townsfolk say it awakens, it walks, and it comes to claim the soul of the one who forgot. A farmer named Elias, his hands calloused and his back bent from a lifetime of labor, had always honored the tradition. He respected the old ways, for he knew the earth remembers. But one long night, after spending hours mending his barn under the weary glow of a lantern, exhaustion coiled around him like a serpent. He stumbled into his home, the scent of hay and sweat clinging to him, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the scarecrow still standing sentinel in the field. As he slept, a change crept over the land. The wind, once a gentle sigh, began to howl, carrying with it a sound that did not belong, the dry, dragging whisper of straw moving through the soil. Out in the cornfield, the wooden post that held the scarecrow groaned, as if under great strain. Something shifted in the pale moonlight. A shape detached itself from the crossbeam, its movements slow, deliberate, and dreadfully wrong. It shuffled through the tall rows of corn, a patient, unnatural gait that promised a long overdue visit. Inside a farmhouse, the embers in the hearth faded to black, starved of air. A chill, heavy and damp, seeped through the floorboards. With a soft click, the front door eased open, inviting the night inside. Elias awoke, not to the crowing of the rooster, but to a profound and unsettling silence. The fire was dead, and the room was unnervingly cold. He felt a draft on his bare feet and looked down to find his worn leather boots were gone. In their place, a trail of muddy footprints led from the heart of his home toward the open door, pointing the way to the waiting field. He grabbed his oil lantern, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and stepped into the pre-dawn gloom. Out in the distance, silhouetted against the dying night, 2 figures stood where there should have been only one. With trembling hands, he walked towards a familiar post in the center of his field. As the lantern's golden light cut through the fog, the impossible truth crashed over him. The scarecrow was still there, but it was now dressed in his own clothes, his own boots upon its feet. The other figure was the empty post. He raised the lantern, its light shaking, and illuminated the burlap face. The crudely stitched mouth, once a simple black line, seemed to shift, to curve into something akin to a smile. A voice, like the rustle of dead leaves, whispered from within the sackcloth. "You left me to see the sun." The lantern slipped from Ilias's numb fingers, shattering against the parched earth. Oil and flame met. Dry stalks caught, and fire crawled eagerly through the corn, a hungry orange beast consuming everything in its path. But the Scarecrow did not move. It did not burn. It simply stood and watched as the flames devoured the field, its button eyes fixed on Elias as his screams were swallowed by the inferno. When the sun finally rose, its morning light fell upon a blackened, smoking field. The Scarecrow stood upright and unharmed, a fine layer of ash dusting its borrowed boots, tendrils of smoke curling from its flannel sleeves. And beneath the burlap, something that was not straw and not cloth took a single living breath, and then went still. After all, a soul is a small price to pay for a sunrise. The fire came without a sound, just a wave of heat that bleached the night sky orange. I remember the smell of burning pine and the brittle snap of dry timber. By morning, the valley was a dead thing, buried under a blanket of smoke and silence. Everything was gone. Everything except for the Scarecrow that stood in the center of what used to be Mara Kincaid's field. It was still there, a dark figure against the grey dawn, its wooden arms outstretched. The flames had licked at it, charring its frame and turning its burlap head to soot, but it hadn't fallen. It just stood there, bowed slightly, as if it had been shielding something precious from the inferno. Nothing else survived. Not the barn, not the fence posts, not even the stones at the edge of the creek. Only the Scarecrow remained, untouched by the true heat. For days, the ground around its post held a strange warmth, long after the embers had died and cold rain had turned the ash to thick black paste. One patch of earth continued to steam. I could feel the heat through the soles of my boots whenever I walked the perimeter. A slow, deep pulse that felt less like residual fire and more like something breathing just beneath the surface. It was a low, steady rhythm in the dead soil. Then on the third night, something began to push up through the slurry of ash and mud. They weren't green shoots. They were pale, almost luminous in the moonlight, thin and sharp like fractured bone. They didn't look like any plant I had ever seen. They felt wrong, wet to the touch, and cold. Despite the warmth still radiating from the earth they grew in, the growth was relentless. Each night, the white stalks rose higher, twisting round one another like sinew. They formed shapes, rough and unsettlingly familiar, humanoid silhouettes woven from ash, straw, and something that looked like dried sinew. They were hollow, incomplete figures, their limbs bent at angles that felt unnatural, their heads smooth and featureless. When the weak moonlight caught them, they looked like statues, carved from bone dust. And when the wind sighed through the valley, they would all lean in unison, turning their blank faces toward Morris House. And they would stay that way, frozen in a silent, collective gaze. By the end of the week, the field was full, a silent congregation of dozens of them. These half-formed things, all standing in attendance, facing the blackened Scarecrow at the heart of their new, dead world. That's when I noticed the Scarecrow itself had changed. The charred burlap of its clothes no longer looked burnt. It was mended, stitched together with strips of a pale, almost skin-like fabric I didn't recognize. Its arms, once simple cross pieces of wood, seemed longer, now weighed down by something shifting just beneath the cloth. It looked full of repair. Mara had tried to dig it up. I found the entry in her journal later. She wrote that the soil beneath the post gave way too easily, like digging into wet clay or soft tissue. Her shovel struck something that wasn't wood or stone. It was soft, and it resisted for a moment, she said. The ground around the hole seemed to shift, to contract, as if she had struck a lung, and the whole field had inhaled sharply in response. The morning after, the Scarecrow's head was no longer bowed. It was turned, aimed directly at her bedroom window. The cloth on its face was new, a fresh patch of that same pale fabric. Her shovel was still there, plunged into the earth beside the post, its wooden handles smeared with thick ash, and something else, something dark and wet that clung to the grain. Her journal stopped after that entry. There was only one final line, scrolled across the bottom of the last page in a hurried, messy script. It said, "The harvest is ready. It just needed flesh." When the neighbors finally drove out weeks later, worried by the silence, they found the house empty. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. But the field was green again, not with those pale, twisted things, but with tall, healthy stalks of corn, perfect and unnaturally lush. And in the center of it all, the Scarecrow stood tall. It was wearing Mara's sun hat. Its face, turned toward the road, was no longer burlap. It was smooth and pale and almost human. Listen close, my dark hearts, for every town has its traditions, its little rituals meant to keep the darkness at bay. But some towns, forget what the darkness truly is. Tonight's tale is one of such a place, a quaint little hamlet called Hollow's Edge, where the soil has a long memory and a terrible appetite. Every autumn, when the leaves turned to rust and the air grew teeth, the good people of Hollow's Edge would gather for their harvest feast, a night of golden lanterns, cider, warmed laughter, and the burning of the Scarecrows. They would drag the stressed sentinels from their posts, piling them high to be consumed by a great bonfire, a ritual they believed marked the end of the growing season and the start of winter's sleep. A simple, charming tradition, wouldn't you say? But traditions, like roots, often go deeper than we care to look. The town records, bound in dusty leather, claim the feast was to thank the soil for its bounty. A quaint, folksy sentiment, yet older writings, scribbled in the margins of forgotten almanacs, whispered of another, more urgent purpose: to keep the ground quiet. A curious choice of words, wouldn't you agree? To quiet, something that was never meant to make a sound. But the people of Hollow's Edge had grown comfortable. They had forgotten the old fears, and in doing so, had become careless. This year, as the townsfolk prepared their celebration, one Scarecrow was left behind. It stood alone on a far hill, overlooking the valley, a tattered silhouette against the dying sun. Too distant for the bonfire's cheerful light to ever reach. An oversight, a simple mistake. But in tales like these, my friends, there are no simple mistakes, only consequences, waiting patiently for their turn. As dusk settled, the feast began. In the town square, the bonfire roared to life, its flames clawing at the sky, higher and hungrier than anyone could recall. For a fleeting moment, the very earth seemed to tremble, a single soft shudder that passed almost unnoticed. Prophet felt like a deep and ancient breath, drawn in after a long, long slumber. Then a child's small voice cut through the rivalry. A tiny finger pointed toward the darkness beyond the fields. Up on the lonely hill, the forgotten Scarecrow was no longer slumped. It stood perfectly upright, its stick-like arms spread wide as if in welcome, and its burlap head, once bowed, was now turned facing the town. A disquiet settled over the crowd. Moments later, a ripple of movement began across the valley, from the freshly harvested fields and the overgrown meadows of long abandoned farms. Other Scarecrows began to rise, not falling but lifting, pulled upward on their wooden posts as the soil beneath them split like dry lips. They ascended from the earth, silent witnesses being called to order. The laughter and music died. The world fell silent. A profound, unnatural stillness descended upon Hollow's edge. The wind held its breath. The crickets choked on their songs. There was only the crackle of the fire and the heavy, frantic beat of human hearts. Then with a sound like a great sigh, the bonfire collapsed. Not outward, in a shower of sparks, but inward, as if swallowed whole. The flames did not turn to smoke. Instead, they were pulled down, drawn into the very soil they were meant to bless. From the pit where the fire had been, thin veins of liquid gold began to spread beneath the fields. A web of eerie light racing through the dirt straight toward the town square. The town preacher, his face a mask of terror, began shouting for prayer. The mayor, a man of bluster and empty authority, screamed for everyone to run. But no one did. Their feet felt rooted to the spot, held fast by a low, powerful hum vibrating up from the ground. It was the feeling of something immense stirring just beneath the surface. A sleeping giant awakened from its earthen bed. In perfect, chilling unison, the Scarecrows turned their heads, every single one, from the nearest field to the farthest hill, swiveled to face the same direction, toward the old stone church at the heart of the town. And then they knelt, every straw-stuffed guardian in the valley, bowed as one, a silent congregation offering their fealty not to the heavens, but to the ground below. Beneath the forgotten Scarecrow on the hill, the earth split wide, releasing a soft, golden radiance that pulsed outward, spreading through the dark soil like luminous roots. The first scream was a prelude to a symphony of terror. The ground itself began to rise, not with violence, but with a slow, inexorable purpose. Soil swelled up around ankles, then knees, then waists. Houses didn't crumble, they sank, swallowed by the rising tide of earth. Roads vanished, fences were submerged. The golden glow washed over everything, a slow, silent wave of consumption until the last rooftop disappeared, and the last cry was muffled by the dirt. At dawn, a profound silence had reclaimed the valley. There were no buildings, no people, no sign that a town called Hollow's Edge had ever existed. There was only the rustle of newly sprouted wheat, already green and impossibly tall, swaying in the morning breeze. The scarecrows remained still, kneeling, their empty eyes fixed on the fertile, empty field where a town once stood, and far away, on a weathered fence post at the edge of the valley. A new carving had appeared, etched deep into the wood, as if by an unseen hand. It read simply, "The soil remembers." They say a man's land is a part of his soul. Old Jacob Sawyer, he felt that more than most. Out on the edge of town, where the roads turn to dirt and the nights get real dark. He worked the same cornfields his father had worked before him, lived alone, talked mostly to the crows, and kept to himself. But some things, they don't let you keep to yourself. One morning, with the fog still clinging low to the ground like a shroud, Jacob saw something wrong. Two figures stood, silhouetted against the rising sun, out in the middle of his corn. Scarecrows. But he only ever kept one. These two were identical, twins of burlap and straw, wearing the same faded plaid shirts, the same worn-out denim. It had to be a prank. Some kids from town with too much time on their hands. Annoyed, Jacob walked out to tear the second one down the dew, soaking the cuffs of his jeans. But the closer he got, the stranger it felt. The first scarecrow was his, familiar and sagging. The second one, it was too perfect. The way its head was tilted, just a fraction to the left, was exactly how he stood when he was tired. The slump of its shoulders held the same weariness he felt deep in his own bones after a long day. It wasn't just a scarecrow. It was a mirror, made of straw and flannel, an uncanny reflection staring back at him without eyes. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against the rough burlap of its face. It was warm, not just sun-warmed, but the deep, living heat of skin beneath the tightly packed straw. He felt it, a slow, rhythmic pulse, faint like a bird's heart, but undeniably there. A cold dread, colder than the morning air, washed over him. He stumbled back, the cornstalks rustling around him like whispers, and ran back to the lonely quiet of his house, locking the door behind him. That night, sleep offered no escape. Jacob dreamt he was routed to the spot, his feet buried in the soil of his own field. He was the scarecrow, unable to move, unable to scream. And through the rows of corn, he watched a figure walk toward his house. A figure that looked just like him, moving with his gait, his purpose. He woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat. The sheets were tangled around his legs, and when he looked, he saw strands of dry straw woven into the cotton. There was dirt, black and rich, packed beneath his fingernails. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Neighbors he'd see in town would mention it casually. "Saw you out in the field late last night, Jacob, just standing there?" He denied, his voice tight, but the fear was a knot in his stomach. He started losing time, hours slipping away like water through his fingers. He'd catch his reflection in the dark glass of a window, and for a terrifying second, it would lag behind, its movements not quite his own. The man in the glass was a stranger, bearing his face. Each dawn brought a new, more horrifying transformation. He'd look out at the field, and the new scarecrow seemed more and more human. The straw looked damp as if with sweat. The stitched eyes seemed to sink deeper, forming shadowed sockets. Its posture relaxed, becoming more natural, more alive. And as it grew more real, the old scarecrow withered, It sagged and emptied, its clothes hanging loose, as if something vital had been drained from it, hollowed out from the inside. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of blood and rust, Jacob grabbed a pitchfork and marched toward the field. The air was unnaturally still. The crows, usually a constant, cawing presence, were gone. A deep silence had fallen over the land. He reached the 2 posts, his heart hammering against his ribs. The original Scarecrow was gone, reduced to a pathetic pile of straw and tattered rags at the base of the pole. And then the other one, the thing that wore his clothes and stood in his place. It slowly, deliberately lifted its head when the sun rose. The next morning, the neighbors saw what they always saw. A single, solitary Scarecrow, standing guard over the cornfield. It looked just right, wearing Jacob Sawyer's favorite shirt and his sturdy work boots. Back at the farmhouse, the front door was slightly ajar. A trail of muddy boot prints LED from the unmade bed across the wooden floor, all the way to the threshold. And there, at the doorway, leading out into the world, they just stopped. In the hollows, where old ways cling to the soil like stubborn roots, you'll find towns like Brindle Creek. It's a quiet place, bound by fields of whispering corn and traditions that run deeper than any well. Their harvest festival wasn't just a celebration, it was a pact, sealed each year with a ritual they called the cornbread. The chosen girl, a daughter of the town, would dance a dress woven from straw and spun with golden thread. She'd lead the townsfolk in a prayer to bless the fields that fed them. Then as twilight bled across the sky, her likeness's straw effigy, made in her image, would be offered to the fire, a thank you note written in smoke to the hungry earth. It was a quaint, harmless custom, after all. The town's pride had always fed the soil, far more than their crops ever did. This year, the honor, if you could call it, that fell to Clara Bell. She was the miller's daughter, with a laugh as bright as the creek in springtime, and a sensible streak that found such old superstitions charmingly foolish. When the town elders came to her with the news, she simply smiled and agreed to play her part. "It's just a harmless tradition," she told her father, brushing a strand of golden hair from her eyes. She saw it as a game, a bit of pageantry before the winter snows came to quiet the world. "A harmless tradition," she said. But tradition, like the soil, has a long and unforgiving memory. On the morning of the ceremony, a stillness fell over Brindle Creek that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. Clara Bell was gone, her bed was made, her window was latched, but the girl herself had vanished like mist in the morning sun. The sheriff, a man who preferred simple answers to complicated truths, figured she'd run off with some traveling boy, tired of the town's suffocating embrace. But the preacher, his face as grim as a tombstone, saw a darker omen. He stood before the worried crowd, his voice a low rumble of prophecy. "The fields remember who forgets," he warned them, his gaze sweeping over the rustling corn. The ritual, he insisted, could not be delayed. The soil was waiting for its due. That evening, the festival began, though a nervous quiet replaced the usual cheer. In the center of the town square, the effigy stood waiting, bound to a heavy wooden post. It wore Clara's gown, a half-finished weave of straw and gold thread that seemed to mock the empty space she'd left behind. The townsfolk gathered, their faces painted in the flickering light of the torches they carried. A hymn rose into the air, a familiar melody now laced with a thread of unease. The preacher raised his hand, and the torches were lowered. Fire licked at the dry straw, crawling up the base of the figure in greedy tongues of orange and red. For a moment, it was beautiful, fleeting sculpture, a flame against the deepening twilight. The crowd, eager to believe in a comforting rhythm of their ritual, began to cheer, their voices rising to drown out their doubt. But their cheers caught in their throats as the figure on the post did something an effigy should never do. It moved. It wasn't the wind. The straw figure twisted, straining against the ropes that held it fast. A scream ripped through the hymn, a sound so raw and terrified it could only have been born from human lungs. It was Clara's voice. For one terrible, frozen moment, the world held its breath. The singing stopped, the cheers died. There was only the sound of the crackling fire, and that one awful choked-off cry. Then the flames surged, roaring higher, swallowing the sound and the sight of the struggling form consuming the town's terrible mistake in a column of blinding light. When the inferno finally died down to embers, leaving a ghost of smoke hanging in the night air, only ashes remain. A few brave souls stepped forward to inspect the charred post, their faces pale in the moonlight. Tucked within the blackened wood, they found fragments of bone, white against the soot. They found melted clumps of golden thread. And there, fused to the grain of the post by the heat, was Clarabelle's gold hair ribbon, a final, silent accusation. No one in Brindle Creek ever spoke of that night again. The silence became its own ritual, a shared guilt that settled over the town like a permanent frost. The next spring, the corn grew with a disturbing vigor, thicker and taller, and a richer shade of gold than anyone could remember. The harvest was impossibly bountiful, but at night, when the wind moved through the stalks, it carried a sound that was almost like weeping Ba. And every harvest since, just as the sun dips below the horizon, a figure is said to appear in the heart of the filter. Slender silhouette, dressed in straw, crowned in firelight gold, forever watching the town that fed her to the soil. 5 stories from the fields, and yet the soil is still hungry. Are you brave enough to return for more? Keep your candles lit and your shadows close. This is Shadows and Wonder, and I'll be waiting for you in the next story.